We now turn to Dr. Ghada Karmi, who will join us shortly, and will talk to us about a farewell to Palestine, a personal experience of the Nakba. Dr. Ghada Karmi is a distinguished medical doctor, activist and author living in the United Kingdom, and she's written several books, In Search of Fatima, which deals with the events of 1948 when she was a young child, Return, a Palestinian memoir, and Married to Another Man, Israel's Dilemma in Palestine. And I can see that Ghada is with us now, so I will disappear gently and listen hard to Ghada for the coming period. And thank you, Ghada, for being with us.
Thank you, Sir Vincent. Really, it's a pleasure to be part of this important conference. And it is my task to take you back to the starting point of this story, the story that Hanan Ashrawi has discussed so eloquently. I want to go back to the Nakba, which I lived through, and which was the beginning of a process that has led us here. Now, I was born in Palestine, and the Palestine I was born into was an Arab country by any measure. It was an Arab country. I was born in Jerusalem, and the area in Jerusalem that we lived in, which was West Jerusalem, was a newish neighborhood, because, you know, Jerusalem means really the old city. The rest was added on at various periods. Now ours, as I say, was a fairly modern neighborhood. It was cosmopolitan. It was had mainly Christian Palestinian families, but it also had English people living there, and also Jews, and particularly German Jews. So at the time, but this is of course before the establishment of the State of Israel, there was no suggestion of anybody being unfriendly to anybody else. And indeed, we knew the Jewish families, and my sister, for example, played with one of the children of one particular family. Now, the Zionists quite early on had their eyes on West Jerusalem. In their plan, they intended to take over that part prior to moving on and expanding, obviously. Now, you need to, I suppose, follow this story through my eyes as a child at the time. Now, what were my concerns in those years before we were forced out? I mean, I was concerned with the house I lived in, with the village woman who looked after us, looked after the house, a woman named Fatima, and our dog, our family dog, whom I love dearly, and my primary school friends. Those were really my concerns, and that was my world, if you like. Now, things began to change for me, I'm saying, at the beginning of 1948. I do not mean, of course, that that's when things really started to change. No, but I'm inviting you to stay with me. As a child, I had no idea about Balfour or the Biltmore program in the United States or President Truman. None of these things meant anything, of course. Now, at the beginning of 1948, an event took place which really made me aware as a child that something was very wrong. That event was the blowing up of a hotel that was in a road above our road. It was called the Semiramis, and it usually had a variety of different nationalities who came to stay, and particularly journalists. That was a sort of haunt of journalists. Well, on the night of the 6th of January 1948, the Haganah, the Israeli army, the Jewish army, blew up the hotel, which became rubble. Now, this was in the early hours of the morning, and my earliest memory is of fear. I thought it was thunder and lightning, and I thought, because of the fire that lit up the sky, the night sky, I thought it was morning. It was the dawn. And I remember asking my parents, who were terrified, and they dragged us all onto the floor with our backs against the bedroom wall. I said, is it the dawn? Is that the sun? Nobody answered. Anyway, that was the beginning of the start in my consciousness, my awareness that things were not doing well with us. Over the next few years, all this got worse. People started to leave our street, and we remained stubbornly, because my mother would say, no Jew is going to kick me out of my house. But of course, inevitably, by April 1948, our street was relatively empty. There was no more to hang on to, and we left in a taxi with shooting around us, with my parents terrified, my brother and my sister older than me, coping somehow, but I really was very scared. And so, what can I tell you? I didn't understand what was happening. All I knew was that I was told we had to leave. And I said, but why? Where are we going to? People were in such a state. I mean, really nobody answered me. And so all I could think of was, I looked at the house and it was already shuttered, and the dog was left behind. It was unbearable to me. How could we leave the dog behind? Anyway, we did, and we ended up in the bus station in Jerusalem. I think people who know Jerusalem will know where I mean. Now, it wasn't like the bus station today. It was absolutely packed out with people fleeing, the cars in short supply, taxi if you were lucky. And, there was no pause, no time for me to say bye-bye. Of course, I didn't know that I wouldn't be back. But for the short term, as I imagined, it would have been bye-bye to the dog, to Fatima, to the house. No time for that. We were stuffed into a taxi and we had to go. And we went to, in our case, to Damascus, hung around there, stood around, people stood around on street corners with news of Palestine and the way one city after the other was being emptied. And it was a time which I don't like to remember, in a way as bad as the time when we left Jerusalem. And it's very important for people to understand that the Nakba was not that instant when we left and we lost our homes. It went on for people because it went on in the places of refuge where they went. In our case, as I say, Damascus, crowded out with refugees. Nobody had jobs. My father had no money. Our bank account in the Palestine bank, the Bank of Palestine was taken over by the Zionists. We had nothing. And in the end, in our case, as I say, my father found work in Britain, of all places, and in London, because the BBC Arabic service had started and they wanted bilingual speakers. My father spoke both Arabic and English very well. And so he was offered a job and he didn't feel he could possibly refuse. So after the initial trauma of leaving Palestine, there was the second trauma of leaving Damascus and arriving in London. And it was, as I say, this is the Nakba played out, because it was terrifying for me. I couldn't encompass London after having been a child in Jerusalem. I'd never been very far anywhere out of our home and out of our area. And here we were in this foreign country, cold, northern, full of very cold people. And that's how it came across to me. However, you know, there it was. When Palestinians were expelled or fled in 1948, between actually 1947 and 49, really you could divide them into two groups. One group that did relatively well, one group that did not do well, ended up in refugee camps, while the others were able to get work or resettle in different countries. You know, when I think about Ukraine, and I have to bring up that parallel, you can't escape it. When I think about the reaction to the Ukraine refugees and the reaction there was to us, we had no Western world backing us. We had nothing but, admittedly, honestly, the support of Arab countries, for which we were very grateful. But we didn't have the West on our side. We had to cope and manage with the help of other Arabs and helping each other. And we had to just get on and survive. So there we were in England. And of course, I've written about all this in my book, In Search of Fatima, if people want to read that memoir. So there we were in England. And when I think that the misery of all of that was then added to, as I was growing up in England, was added to the erasure of my story. I mean, I went to school, people no longer use the word Palestine. We were reading about or being taught about the Old Testament, the return of the Jews and how lovely this was. Nobody was interested in what I had to say, my story. Anyways, so, you know, it was a really dreadful story, this, because not only did people lose their homes and their property and their lives, in the case of my parents, I can't begin to imagine how my father, who had a promising career with the mandate authorities, the British mandate, which ruled Palestine, he was a school teacher, he was in the education department and had been recently given a rise and a new position, and he was looking forward to it, all cut off, all ended. My mother, who was a housewife, living a nice life with her friends, suddenly severed. And there she is in London. She doesn't speak English. She can't understand. She can't absorb the shock of having lost her home and ending up in a hostile society. And what she used to say, and this is for the Balfour Project, and what a good project this is, because remember, my mother would say to my father, look, I can understand we had to find somewhere else to live, but why here, for God's sake? They gave our country away. Why are we living with them? So there it was. And look at what's happened since. Today, and I take on board Hanan Ashrawi's optimism, I take on board the promise that we have in the younger generation, the fact we Palestinians have never given up and we never will. Yet, you know, we have ended up fragmented, our society, our Palestinian society smashed. We have ended up as communities in different countries in the world. We have separate development. It's unavoidable. You can't help it. You know, American Palestinians, German Palestinians, British Palestinians, each, of course, have Palestine in common, but they are otherwise quite different. They're used to something else. So we've got this situation. And to make it worse, We can't forget, because Israel is ongoing. Its assaults on the Palestinians form what we call the ongoing Nakba. I want to leave you with my thoughts in the midst of all this unhappiness and the unhappy memories and the way that Palestinian society was destroyed. The thought is that it seems to me that we have to talk about solving this. We have to. Of course, there will be people like me and others who will retain the history, will talk about it, will narrate it, will write about it. But what we want is an end to this. We really do. I can only echo the ideas that Hanan Ashrawi spoke of, in that there has to be an end, and there is only one way I can see it, and that is in the creation of a state in which people have equal rights, in which they live in a democracy, and that is the single state in Israel, Palestine. That seems to me to be the way forward. Please don't forget about the refugees. People tend to, 6 million sitting in camps after all this time. What a disgrace. These people need a solution. And the solution, in my estimation, can only be in a single democratic state, which brings back the pluralist society that we used to have in Palestine. And I hope it happens.
Thank you. Thank you, Ghada. That was very moving, and I don't mean that lightly. But thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your wisdom.